But not even Edith could convince Wilson to compromise on even minor details concerning the League. The Senate would vote down Wilson's peace plan. The U.S. would not enter the League, dooming it.
Do you think it could have prevented World War II?
Yeah, I'll go on record. I think a League of Nations, Wilson's League of Nations, could have stopped World War II.
A controversial take on a controversial president whose influence is with us today.
We stand in the presence of an awakened nation. Plainly, it is a new age.
The most lasting piece of the Wilson legacy has to be that one line, the world must be made safe for democracy, for good or for bad. That really, though, has become the foundation of our foreign policy. And whenever this country even thinks of intervening in Syria or in Egypt or Iraq or wherever,
it started with Wilson.
It's really that Wilson notion that there is a moral obligation. Which is what I've been doing for the last 13. And indeed, Woodrow Wilson has been part of my life since I was a teenager, 15 years old, with one name in my hip pocket, and that is Woodrow Wilson. And I've not written about a Southerner, and most people to this day don't realize Woodrow Wilson was a Southerner. I said I've not written about somebody from the worlds of politics and government and higher education, also an essential part of the Wilson story, and that's what I'd like to do next. My publisher said that's a great idea. We'd love to have your book on Wilson. Before you do that, though, may I just ask one personal question? My publisher said, I know you don't really talk about this, but I'm aware of the fact that very often you go away on weekends, you take trips with Katharine Hepburn. Is that somebody you would ever write a book about? And I said, well, it's funny you should mention that, and I don't talk about it, and that's one of the reasons she lets me see her all the time, because I don't talk about it. But from the time I met her, she asked me if I would write a book about her. And of course, I thought this was a wonderful idea, and I said, now, why do you think I should write a book about you? And she said very simply, because I'm fascinating. And I said, well, yes, you are. No, I mean, I'm really fascinating, and you should do this book. And so, anyway, I'll spare you the rest. But I then went to my publisher and said, look, she'd really like me to do the book. So yes, the one thing is, she said I couldn't publish a book while she was alive. So my publisher said, fine, why don't you write the book? She's going to die someday, although she lived to be 96. So I really wondered. But my publisher said, why don't you write it? We'll lock it up, and as soon as she dies, we will publish the book. And indeed, she died in 2003, and within 13 days, we published my memoir, which was the story of her telling her life to me. So it was quite wondrous. Now, to get to our story, now that I've told you how I got here, now I'll tell you why we're here today. And that is, I was now free and clear to write this book about Woodrow Wilson, a man I had been thinking about since I was a teenager. And that, I can tell you, was a long time ago. So, I have had evolving in my mind several thoughts about Woodrow Wilson over these many decades. And in the last 10, 13 years that I was working full-time writing his life, two thoughts in particular have really crystallized, and they became the main strands of the book. And they are ultimately the answer to the question I posed for myself and for you all, which is, why would somebody spend 13 years of his life waking up to Woodrow Wilson every day? And here they are. And I'm going to say the first one, and you might immediately think, oh no, I can give you a better answer than the one you just gave, Scott. But here it is. Here we go. I believe Woodrow Wilson is the most influential figure of the 20th century, period. Not the most influential American, not the most influential figure of a certain decade, but I think this man influenced the 20th century and now into the 21st century more than anybody who lived. And over the next few minutes, I hope I'll give you enough information to support that, and maybe even enough that you'll want to argue with me about that. The second one is a little more subjective, if you can imagine that. And it's this. I believe Woodrow Wilson's personal story is the most dramatic story that has ever unfolded in the White House. Now, what I try to do in my books is personalize my subjects. I try to take great figures, some of them famous like Charles Lindbergh, some of them unknown like Max Perkins. But in either case, and here I have Woodrow Wilson, this extremely famous figure, although receding into the mists of memory, I must say. But here I've got this figure Wilson. And what I try to do in my books is at all times to humanize them, to personalize them. And so what I want, if you can imagine weaving here, I've got this one main thread I've got going across in which I want to show his great influence. And cutting across it, weaving in and out of that at all times, will be this extremely dramatic personal story. Because I don't think you can separate those strands. I think his personal life constantly informs and influences who he was as a president. But at the same time, I think what was going on in his professional life deeply affected, obviously, what was happening in his personal life. Now, because we only have, a fraction of an hour here to discuss this, the best I can do, I think, in the next half hour or so is give you some bullet points, some things, I want you to walk away with some real take-homes about Woodrow Wilson. And I must say, walking through this museum, I didn't glibly say that this place was a national treasure today, this morning. But now I've spent some time walking through it. It genuinely is. And as I was walking through it, it's so good, this museum. In almost every room, I had this powerful sense of Woodrow Wilson's presence. Because what I think this museum does so well is personalize and contextualize, so you can really feel what life was. So here, let's personalize and contextualize Woodrow Wilson a little. I'm going to give you a few points. If you go to a bar tonight, I want you to win a few bar bets. And some of you will. Here we go. Woodrow Wilson is the most religious president we've ever had. Woodrow Wilson was the son of a Presbyterian minister. He was the grandson of a Presbyterian minister. If you shake the family trees of the Woodrows and the Wilsons, another dozen Presbyterian ministers will just fall to the ground. This is low-hanging fruit for the Wilsons and the Woodrows. Presbyterianism, it was everywhere. Woodrow Wilson, every night of his life, got on his knees and prayed. Woodrow Wilson read scripture every day of his life. Woodrow Wilson said grace before every meal of his life. This is a man whose religion informed and influenced everything he did. Now, I know we've had a lot of religious presidents in the past. Usually they get very religious once every 4 years. Woodrow Wilson was religious every day of his life. Every decision he made was based on his faith and his deep morality. Hold on to that one. It's going to pay off later. Woodrow Wilson is the first Southerner to have been elected President of the United States after the Civil War. Now, this was an extremely important event in 1912. Civil War, 1861 to 65. A Southerner, you see, hadn't been elected in a half a century. This was a signal event because it really symbolized for the first time that the United States were reunited. that this great rift that split the nation in two finally had come together again. Woodrow Wilson was born in 1856 in Stanton, Virginia. His father, being a Presbyterian minister, traveled through the South, so young Woodrow Wilson was raised in Augusta, Georgia, Columbia, South Carolina, and Wilmington, North Carolina. Woodrow Wilson's first memory, when he's not even 4 years old, but his first memory was when he was living in Augusta, Georgia. It was November of 1860. And now, again, not even 4 years old, he goes outside and he hears somebody yelling, "Lincoln just got elected. There's going to be a war." Now, almost all the other biographies of Woodrow Wilson make little or no mention of this episode. I make a fair amount of it in my book because Wilson made a lot of it. It meant a lot to Woodrow Wilson. He carried that memory with him all his life. Other books talk little about the influence of the Civil War in Wilson's life. I try to point out how important it was because he often said how important it was. This was a little boy who remembered what the war did. He remembered the devastation of the war. He remembered the deprivation of the war. He remembered seeing his father's church in Augusta turned into a hospital. He saw neighbors coming back from the war maimed. He saw a lot of neighbors who didn't come back. The war was present all the time in Wilson's youth. When they moved on to Columbia, this was during Reconstruction. Now Wilson, a little older, a young teen, really coming of age, paying attention to news, politics, government. He's very mindful of what was going on with Reconstruction, with carpetbaggers, with what he thought was a tremendous abuse on both sides. And it disturbed him greatly and interested him in the political process. Woodrow Wilson is the most educated president we've ever had. I'm quick to add, I didn't just say the most intellectual president. I'd be hard-pressed to forget Thomas Jefferson, and I could throw in 2 or 3 others, I think, who could rival Wilson intellectually. But he is, to this day, the only president we've ever had who holds a PhD on top of his law degree, on top of his bachelor's degree, which he got at Princeton University.
On the 1st of June 1916, Louis Brandeis became the first Jewish justice on the Supreme Court of the United States of America. Louis Brandeis was born to Jewish parents who had moved to the United States from Prague in the aftermath of the European revolutions of 1848. He grew up in Kentucky and graduated from Harvard Law School with the highest grades ever achieved up to that point when he was 20 years old. Brandeis soon established himself as a talented barrister and set up a law firm in Boston with Samuel Warren, a friend from his time at Harvard. The success of the firm provided him with the financial security to take on an increasing number of progressive cases that championed social justice, and for which he took no payment, since he deemed them to be of public interest. This led to Brandeis earning the moniker the People's Lawyer, as he challenged the power of big business, fought to expose public corruption, and oppose the monopolistic behaviour of oligarchs. On the 28th of January 1916, President Woodrow Wilson nominated Brandeis to the Supreme Court, but he faced bitter opposition from business owners and other members of the social and economic elite who viewed him as a radical, alongside broader anti-Semitic attitudes. As a result, it took 125 days for him to be finally confirmed on the 1st of June by a vote of 47 to 22. As a Supreme Court Justice, Brandeis wrote opinions in favour of individual liberty and freedom of speech while protecting citizens' rights to privacy. When he eventually retired from the Supreme Court in February 1939, the New York Times, which had led criticism of his nomination in 1916, referred to him as one of the great judges of our time.
In discussing the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is at the center of U.S. interests in the Middle East and has been for the last century, it's important to start with the Balfour Declaration. One of the treaties that was issued during World War I in order to fight the war was the Balfour Declaration. And it's important, it lays the groundwork for understanding how the British dealt with the Jews in Palestine and how the international community has adjudicated the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's a very simple declaration. It was issued in November 2nd, 1917, by Sir Balfour, who was the Foreign Minister of Great Britain, to Lord Rothschild, a leading British Jew who was a member of the Zionist World Organization. It reads, "Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet." So here is the main paragraph, and it is one that is going to bedevil the legal environment of Israel and Palestine. It says, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Signed by Lord Balfour. Now, this very simple paragraph is jammed with ambiguity. If you were amongst the Jewish leaders of the Zionist Federation and you were trying to determine what does this mean for the Jews, you would quickly discover that it's full of ambiguity. For example, what is a Jewish homeland? It's certainly not a nation state. The Jews were not to govern the mandate of Palestine, which was going to be governed by the British. So what does national home mean? Perhaps it means you could go in as many and large numbers as you wanted to migrate from Europe to Palestine. Would you be able to assume authority over the country once the British leave? All those questions are left open. What you would be happy about is that it mentions the Jewish people and it mentions a national home. So national and people are both used to describe Jews. And that is going to give the Jewish people a big leg up in the fight for legitimacy in the international community. Because if we look at how the Palestinians are referred to, in fact, we find much greater ambiguity. Because the key clause is the one that reads, "It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine." So how are the Arab Palestinians referred to? They're not referred to by name. They're referred to as the non-Jewish communities in Palestine. And this means that they're neither people, nor are they Palestinians. They're not referred to, like the Jewish people are, as a people. Why is this important? We have to look at this in the context of the League of Nations, which was established by the help and really under the authority of Woodrow Wilson at the end of World War I, in order to set up a new system of international law to prevent colonies and great powers from gobbling up the territory of the world. Woodrow Wilson declared as part of his 14 points that was embodied in the League of Nations that all peoples had the right to self-determination. This was revolutionary. It gave hope to many of the smaller peoples of the world that they would be able to free themselves of colonial domination. But of course, in the language of all peoples have the right to self-determination. How do you get self-determination? How do you become a nation state? You have to be a people first. In the Balfour Declaration, it's written that the Jews are a people and they have a right to a national home. For the Palestinian Arabs, of course, they don't achieve this level of recognition. They're defined as non-Jewish communities, and they have civil and religious rights. What does that mean? Of course, those are both very ambiguous terms. Civil rights are unclear. Religious rights means, of course, perhaps they can go to their mosques, they can pray, or their churches. For the Christian Palestinians, who made up about 10% of the population of Palestine. But they don't have political rights. They certainly don't have national rights. And this problem of a non-identity is going to bedevil the Palestinians right up to the modern day. We see that it's only around the 1967 war that the Palestinian community develops the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, that fights through terrorism and other means to try to get the world to recognize them as a Palestinian people. But nowhere in international law does the word Palestinian get written down until 1993, during the Oslo Accords, when the United States, Israel, and the Palestinians sit down to talk peace. At that point, we get the first time that the Palestinians are recognized as a people. Previous to that, the Palestinian Liberation Organization was seen as a terrorist organization. It was illegal for any American official to talk to a member of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. So it takes from 1917, when the Balfour Declaration was issued, until 1993, before the Palestinians are recognized in international law as a people who deserve the right to self-determination. And even then, they haven't arrived at their object of having a nation state. The Palestinian Authority that was established after Oslo Accords in the West Bank has been struggling to get national identity. The Americans and the Israelis see the Palestinian Authority and call it the Palestinian Authority, where the Palestinians call themselves the PNA, the Palestinian National Authority. They insert that word national in there because they want to achieve national rights. The United States and Israel are holding off giving that name to them until a final peace agreement is signed between Palestinians and Israelis, at which point they will achieve their national rights. But until that day, they remain only a Palestinian people with limited rights in the West Bank. And the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis continues. Those questions of identity are all embedded in this one little paragraph. For the Jews, it offered the hope of a national home and perhaps at the end of it, national independence. But before the Jews would achieve that, they would have to build up the institutions of a nation and finally go to war in 1948 in order to win and conquer the territory of Israel.
Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object. The Balfour Declaration was the beginning of really a massive new chapter in the 2,000-year longing of the Jewish people for its land. Of course, Jews had never forsaken the dream of return, and that return, Shivat Zion, the return home to Zion, was written into every Jewish heart. But it wasn't until the 19th century that that process of return really gathered momentum. In 1876, the British novelist George Eliot wrote perhaps the first Zionist novel, Daniel Deronda. And there was a huge wellspring of feeling in Britain, very much among Christians, that the dawn of a new age would see the return of Jews to their land. 20 years earlier had been the first Zionist Congress, Theodor Herzl's dramatic shift of Zionism from a dream and an aspiration for individuals to a political program. The fact of the Balfour Declaration was the first shift of this from an aspiration to a real possibility. So this was the first time a national government had said, Jews have the right to return home. It was a bold and history-transforming act. What was unique about the Balfour Declaration was, I think, three things. First of all, this was the ultimate anti-imperialist gesture. Don't forget, between the Roman conquest and the First World War, Israel had simply been a part, an administrative district in an empire. Christian empires, and then the various Islamic empires, ultimately by the Ottoman Empire. So it had never been a nation in its own right. So as part of this new world brought into being in the First World War, one consequence of which was the final death of the Ottoman Empire, was a sense of giving lands back to their original inhabitants, all the lands given back to Arabs, given back to Jews. So it was the anti-imperialist gesture. Secondly, it was the only bit of this gesture covering all the regions which actually reaffirmed a historically grounded state, the biblical state and land of Israel. All the others, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, were all artificial creations that had never existed as nation states in their own right. And that is one of the reasons why even today all those areas are riven by ancient tribal and civil animosities. Whereas Israel was the only country that had been a nation state of its own for 1,000 years, from the days of the judges to the final Second Temple period. So it was a beautifully anti-imperialist gesture, and it was the restoration of a historic nation to its historic homeland. And the third thing that was so powerful but tragically not fully realized was that it provided Jews with a place of refuge. Now, had there been open access of Jews to the land of Israel, I don't know how many millions of Jewish lives might have been saved during the Holocaust. But of course, what happened during the Holocaust was that Jews realized there was nowhere they would freely go. But the fact remains that the Balfour Declaration recognized that Jews as a nation, subject to 1,000 years of persecution, needed a place that they could call home in the Robert Frost sense of the place where when you have to go there, they have to let you in. In 1917, Britain was still deep into World War I, and it would have been so easy for it to ignore the long-term vision and focus instead on the immediacies of war. And it says something for the vision and moral courage of Britain's political leadership at the time, that it said, no, this war that we are fighting is not for ourselves alone, but to create a more just and secure world. And for it to be able to say to Jews, and indeed to the Arab world as well, let us not forget that this was part of a larger picture. The age of empire is over. We want to give back these lands to their original inhabitants. That was visionary and moral politics of a high order, and we should salute it in retrospect. The Balfour Declaration was very clear in a rather murky area that it recognized the right of Jews to a homeland, but it also respected the rights of the other people who were living there at the time. So it was predicated on some peaceful coexistence of Jews and Arabs in the land. And for a moment it seemed as if that might happen, because 2 years after the Balfour Declaration, Chaim Weizmann, who was the leader of the Zionist movement at the time, and Emir Faisal, who was the leading Arab politician at the time, came to an agreement in which Jews recognized the claim of Arab nationalism and Muslims recognized the claim of Jewish nationalism. It was a very blessed moment in which both sides saw that they would both gain from a Jewish presence in the region. And therefore it is the sense of possibility that we need to recapture, because the reasons for coexistence have not diminished in 100 years. But what has diminished is the sense that each is willing to make space for the other. On the Jewish side, we've always been willing to make space. Weizmann was, Ben-Gurion was. There have been key moments when Israel offered peace and statehood to the Palestinians, and unfortunately met with very uncompromising attitudes. I don't want to level blame in any direction here, but the dream of the Balfour Declaration, of this coexistence of two distinct groups of people, remains the dream today, and I don't think we should waste another 100 years in unrealized dreams. My plea is that finally we make space for one another. The Balfour Declaration does dramatically illustrate the power of a single individual, let alone a small group, to change history. Don't forget, the return to Zion had been a dream for 2,000 years, but it took Theodor Herzl to turn it into an effective political movement. It took Chaim Weizmann, an extraordinarily charismatic figure, to persuade leading figures in Britain to issue the Balfour Declaration. It took David Ben-Gurion to provide that visionary leadership that brought the state into being. Here are three individuals who changed the pattern of history, and one shouldn't forget the role of women in this story, like Dorothy de Rothschild, Dorothy Pinto as she was before she was married, who was a key factor in helping Weizmann achieve these results with the British cabinet. So here are individuals who really, by the force and courage of their conviction, brought others with them and changed the world. I believe that the world is a better place for the state of Israel. It's not just Jews who have benefited from the return of a people to its land, even the return of a language, the language of the Bible, to everyday use, the extraordinary achievements of the state of Israel. And one element of that was the Balfour Declaration. So, in looking back at this seminal moment in history, we have to say thank you to the vision of the British government then, and we hope the world will come to see how Israel is a symbol of hope for any small and much persecuted people when given the chance to create a new chapter in the story of humankind, which is what Israel is in today's world.
Amid the fabled hills of Judea in southwest Asia stands Jerusalem, the capital of Palestine, sacred to three of the world's great religions. To Mohammedans, who ruled Palestine for nearly 13 centuries and still regard it as their own, Jerusalem is almost as sacred as Mecca. To hundreds of millions of Christians, this is the Holy Land. Here, Jesus of Nazareth trod the slow, agonizing road to Calvary and the cross. Here, a great Christian shrine has been erected on the spot believed to be where Jesus began the life he was to sacrifice for all mankind. One of the oldest traditions in Palestine's history, stretching back beyond recorded time, is that of the Hebrews, symbolized by the Wailing Wall, place of lamentation and prayer since the days of Herod the Great. In no other religion has Palestine a more deep and mystical significance. Throughout all the sorrowful centuries since the Hebrews were scattered over the face of the earth, their religious rituals have kept ever before them the memory of Palestine as the land promised them by Moses. Today, millions of them center their immemorial hopes for fulfillment of this promise on the new Palestine, with its shining city of Tel Aviv, built by Jews on desert and swampland. Here, world Jewry sees rising at last, a homeland in which the tribes of Israel, wanderers for over 3,000 years, may come together once again as a nation. After Lord Allenby conquered the Holy Land in 1917, the Jews were promised a national home in Palestine by Britain's Earl of Balfour, a policy endorsed by Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations, which made Palestine a British mandate. But in 1939, with war in the offing, the oil pipeline from Iraq through Palestine became one of Britain's major strategic worries, along with the Suez Canal, the empire's lifeline to the Far East. To ensure an uninterrupted supply of oil for its planes, tanks, and ships, Britain had to maintain peace at all costs with the predominantly Arab population, which had long been resentful of Jewish immigration. To this end, London issued a white paper which strictly limited the number of Jews admitted into Palestine. In the war years that followed, only a few thousand of Europe's millions of unhappy Jews were able to escape the fascist tyranny and seek refuge in Palestine. By the war's end, hundreds of thousands of survivors, without homes or possessions, faced a future without hope unless some place on earth could be found for them. To Europe's surviving Jews, free access to Palestine, their land of promise, is today more urgently needed than at any time in the long and tragic history of the people of Israel. Convinced that the excuse for keeping Palestine closed had ended with the war, the Jews of America brought strong pressure to bear on Britain.
This conference urges the British government to abrogate the policy set out in the White Paper of 1939 and to open Palestine to unrestricted Jewish immigration and resettlement.
Refugee Jews able to get to Palestine find there a community to a large extent self-governing. In the Jewish Agency, representing the Jewish people in the development of their national home, are centralized the administrative and executive functions of the community. The Anglo-Palestine Bank financed much of Palestine's war-created industry, and in cooperation with the Jewish Agency, has grub-staked thousands of refugees. Palestine's prosperity is reflected in Tel Aviv's own stock exchange, where any fluctuations in national stocks and bonds are watched with an eagle eye by the local brokers. Investments in hydroelectric plants alone amount to millions of dollars. The waters of the River Jordan supply the main source of power for scores of Palestine's industrial establishments, which produce millions of dollars worth of goods a year, much of it available for export. Many industries have benefited by the skill of trained craftsmen who escaped from Europe. A whole new diamond cutting industry has been built, and its future assured by agreement with the British Diamond Trust. In recent years, a modest start in shipbuilding has been made in the harbor at Tel Aviv, and the facilities which in war were devoted to the construction of minesweepers are now being used to turn out boats for Palestine's fast-growing fishing fleet. On the shores of the Dead Sea, hundreds of feet below sea level, new plants extract thousands of tons of potash, bromine, and other valuable chemicals each year. To improve industrial processes and develop new products, constant research is carried on by world-famous scientists like Dr. Chaim Weizmann and his sister Anna. Ensuring the continuity of Orthodox religion, a Talmud school trains future rabbis who, at an early age, begin to acquire the knowledge and wisdom for which they will be revered in future years. Traditionally an intellectual people, the Jews have established Hebrew University, on whose faculty are some of Europe's most famous scholars, and which is today the center of Palestine's cultural renaissance. No less important than education is the physical well-being of Palestine's children. In the last 25 years, the health of the people of Palestine has been immeasurably improved, due chiefly to the work of Jewish hospitals and laboratories. Hadassah Hospital, supported by contributions from the United States, trains scores of nurses who will go out to the pioneer settlements to aid in the development of their country. But of first importance to the national welfare is the production of food. And in agricultural schools, Jews have acquired skills which have enabled them to refute the widely held belief that they do not make good farmers. Now, over 30% of them make their living from the soil, which they have reclaimed from the swamp and desert. Most of Palestine's agricultural workers live in the cooperative settlements which have been developed in their ancestral homeland during the past 20 years. In these settlements, where work begins before sunrise, every detail of daily life is based on the principle of cooperation. All work in these communities is divided and assigned by an elected committee, whose members must take into account the age and strength of the colonists before assigning them their daily chores. As a result of this program of training, careful planning, and hard work, production of food by Jews in Palestine has almost doubled in recent years. But there are also settlements wherein those who prefer to farm their own land, some 22% of the agricultural population, can live and flourish. Following the same cardinal rule of self-help which applies in the co-ops, the individual farmer must work his tract of land to the best of his ability, for he is expected to make the interest payments on his long-term loan at regular intervals. constantly the immigrants carry on their fight to increase the yield of the land. Always the first and most pressing need has been water, which must be dammed up during the rainy season for use in irrigating farmland during the long months of drought. Through a complex irrigation system built at a cost of many millions of dollars, water flows throughout 100,000 acres of once arid land. But though a good beginning has been made in the areas occupied by the Jews, they believe that nearly all of Palestine's 6 million acres could be made to bear crops. The search for water goes on in isolated desert camps. On land abused and eroded for centuries, teams of experts sink test wells, and on their findings will depend the future of that land, whether it is to remain a desert waste or whether, given water, it will be the site of another new and flourishing community, brought to life by thousands of settlers. Many a barren field has been cleared in Palestine to make way for vineyards and farms and villages. Many plans have been carried out to enlarge the reclaimed land areas so that they can support thousands of new settlers. To maintain in these areas Palestine's high standard of health, research stations have been established in an effort to stamp out the disease which for so many years has sapped the vitality and taken the lives of the natives. Here, the discoveries of modern medical science are made available to Jew and Arab alike. Though Palestine is still predominantly Arab, the Jewish population increased greatly from the early 20s until 1940. Since that time, as a result of British immigration restrictions, the Jewish increase has scarcely kept pace with that of the Arabs. Side by side with the Jewish population, the Arabs, outnumbering them 2 to 1, live in their immemorial manner. Though noted for their independence and readiness to fight, the Arabs have in recent years been coming into Palestine in increasing numbers as workers. For the high wages they earn on the Jewish-owned farms and plantations bring them a new and welcome prosperity. And not only has the working class Arab profited by the presence of the Jews in Palestine, but to many an Arab property owner, wealth and pleasant living have come from the sale of his land to the immigrants. Nevertheless, the Arabs are determined to keep Palestine an Arab country and to resist every move by Britain to admit more refugees. And their threats are backed up by the League of Arab States and by armed and trained men, ready to shatter the peace of the Near East by a religious war. Repeatedly, the London spokesman for the Arab states has warned Britain's government that its policy is not acceptable to the Arabs.
Every Jew that arrives in Palestine is one more brick in the structure of the proposed Zionist state, one more unit towards the Zionist majority against the Arabs, so that it is impossible for the Arabs to regard the matter only in its humanitarian aspect. The political question was finally settled by the White Paper, and any attempt to force more refugees on Palestine now, on whatever grounds it is ostensibly made, would be a breach of that settlement.
But the Jews, whose arguments for a free Palestine before the war were strong, are sure that they now have an irresistible case. For not only have millions of men and women of Jewish faith been tortured and murdered in Europe, but 30,000 who formed the Jewish Brigade fought in the Desert Campaign and in Italy to free the world of fascism. Today, the quota under which refugees from Europe can enter Palestine is the concern of Jews the world over. And they fervently hope that in the future, all Jews who wish to will be permitted to enter Palestine, far from the scenes of their torture and degradation, to pursue happiness in their ancient homeland as free men and women.
Dawn broke that day on a new epic, one that would carry the name of a man whose ideas and ideals would extend well into the next century. When did you write that?
Actually, I wrote that about 13 years ago. When I started, I had this feeling about Wilson, that he is still very much with us. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to write the book. I mean, I've long had a fascination with Wilson. But I thought of all the presidents of the 20th century, he perhaps lingers the longest and the most.
Why?
Well, I think there are several reasons. One is so many of the programs Wilson initiated are with us to this day. I mean, I think the foundation to our economy, the Federal Reserve System, that goes back to Wilson. Certainly, our foreign policy is rooted in a speech Woodrow Wilson gave in 1917 on April 2nd when he said the world must be made safe for democracy, and he was calling for American entry into World War I. Really, all our foreign policy decisions since then, for good or for bad, are rooted in that. So that's something. The other reasons I wanted to write about Wilson were, I think, for the ideals and ideas. I mean, here's a man who was so high-minded, and I don't think we've ever had a president quite so high-minded as Wilson. I thought that's a good thing to remind ourselves of. But she was interesting. She was a genuinely interesting woman. She was also the first socially active first lady that we had. You know, we think of Eleanor Roosevelt as being there in the trenches. Ellen Wilson was really the first to take on a social cause here in Washington, which was the slums. And she thought the way the African Americans lived in this city was just appalling. And so she literally used to drag members of Congress through the alleys of Washington just to see what was happening. And literally on her deathbed, she called out to Wilson, who had proposed some legislation, to say, you know, have they passed the legislation yet? And indeed they did, just moments before she died.
Did you have a different attitude then about the races?
Well, no, I think their attitudes were very similar, which is to say, again, we have to put ourselves in the 19th century, not just the 20th century. Wilson, again, did not want to keep blacks down. He did believe separate but equal might work, should work, had to work.
That was new in the Admiral Grayson, his doctor's papers?
Yes, I was lucky enough, if you wait long enough, you know, papers still keep surfacing. And, you know, we're a young country. And, you know, here 100 years later, though, some fascinating papers were just Dr. Cary T. Grayson, he was an admiral, who was Woodrow Wilson's personal physician and became a great confidant and political advisor, in fact. He kept meticulous notes of, I mean, he literally had his hand on the pulse of the president. And he took notes especially in the last years of the Wilson presidents, but also the years after that when he retired to Washington here. And again, you see all this humanizing detail, the most striking of which is this was a very sick man, physically and ultimately mentally as well. And a lot of this comes out in these Grayson archives.
There are three things that you said about him. One, that he couldn't see out of one eye.
Yes.
Two, that he played 1,200 rounds of golf when he was president, more than anybody in history.
Yes, not forgetting Dwight Eisenhower.
And that he's the last president to write his own speeches.
Yes.
How much evidence do you have that he wrote all those speeches?
Well, there's a lot of evidence. that he wrote all his own speeches, not the least of which comes from the fact that Wilson, as a teenager, learned shorthand, and shortly after that learned how to type. And when he was, in fact, practicing law in Atlanta, he had his own typewriter. And they're these wonderful contraptions. They're quite simple, but quite complicated at the same time. They're very sophisticated little machines. So what we have documents of Wilson's shorthand notes of even the most important speeches he ever gave. The great April 2nd, 1917 speech, asking for a declaration of war, with the immortal phrase, "The world must be made safe for democracy," is originally written in shorthand. And then he types a draft, and then he writes over that with pencil or pen, making corrections. And then you can see the subsequent drafts after that. So there's plenty of evidence that he wrote all his own speeches. And I should add that a lot of the speeches weren't really written. His campaign speeches, for example, he was a brilliant orator. He was just a natural speaker. And when he did hundreds of campaign speeches, he would go out there with a card with maybe 5 bullet points on it. And he would just go out and talk extemporaneously for an hour, hour and a half. And somebody would then transcribe the speeches so we have copies of them. And in all those speeches, I almost never came across a grammatical error, a problem in syntax, a paragraph that wasn't fully and naturally formed. Every paragraph seemed to have some lovely metaphor to it. He just thought oratorically.
What was President Wilson's attitude towards individual Jews, the Jewish people, Judaism, and Zionism, if there was any connection there?
I think fundamental here, he's been called our most religious president. He's fundamentally very, very interested in the Bible, in religion. He can quote the Bible with incredible felicity. There's a famous story from Princeton where the head of the Princeton Theological Seminary stands up to roast Woodrow Wilson at a dinner. And the president of the seminary has prepared a whole list of parables of Christ, and he uses those cleverly to refute all of Woodrow Wilson's academic reform proposals. And after that, Wilson leaps to his feet in the back of the room, and he rattles off twice as many parables in favor of his own reform policies, and he did it off the top of his head. So he is famous for his theological interest, for sure. And notice when he writes the charter for the League of Nations, he calls it the covenant. So being so devout, he prays by his bedside every night. Being so devout, I think he's extremely susceptible to the idea of Zionism. And his friend Louis Brandeis, who will be the first Jewish person appointed to the Supreme Court by Wilson, and I'll say Brandeis and Wilson were peas in a pod because they both detested big business and were rabid reformers. Brandeis comes to Wilson and says, "You've got to back this British Balfour Declaration. You've got to back this British proposal. It's in the middle of the war now. And this proposal will take the Holy Land from the Ottoman Empire, and it will give it to the Jewish people of the world." An extraordinary proposal, and instantly Wilson is fascinated by this. This is the sort of great leap that Wilson just loves. And he says, "I consider it a privilege to restore the Holy Land to its rightful owners." So Wilson is instantly on board. And in fact, he says with deep feeling, "Imagine that I, the son of a manse, having grown up next to the church all his life, that it should be on him ordained that he should restore the Holy Land to the Jewish people." And this, endears Woodrow Wilson greatly to Jewish people around the world. that he is on board with this, and that's tremendously important to have the President of the United States backing this Zionist ideal is quite extraordinary. And Wilson is always quite close to Jewish people. I'm just speculating here, but I think Wilson thought of himself as an outsider in American society, proudly American. And yet he's a Southerner. South has been disgraced. He's a Southerner living in the North. He also calls himself a recent immigrant. Wilson's family, only 70 years earlier, had been entirely in England. He's been called, in a way, the least American president because he's, he doesn't go back to the Revolutionary period. And also, he's an intellectual in an era that's increasingly commercial. And so I think, just speculating, I think he does really admire what Jewish people had accomplished in the United States. And he wants to make it easier for them to immigrate and escape from Europe. When he's running in 1912, a Jewish newspaper in Boston runs a big ad that said every Jewish person should support Woodrow Wilson because he's promised he will punish Russia for the mistreatment of Jews in Russia. And so there was great enthusiasm for Wilson among the Jewish people. And I think in many ways that's still the case.
The American people, America, should view Wilson's legacy from the perspective of 2021, where we see things so differently, and it's hard to get to all the nuances and the complexities of the time that he lived because it's so different from our times. What should be his legacy, and how do you view the different, tear down the statues, rename the halls, the universities, etc.?
The collapse.
You can punt on that also if you want. That's fine. You can punt on this one also.
The collapse of Wilson's reputation has been extraordinary to watch. It's happened very, very quickly. Princeton has taken the name of Wilson off the Woodrow Wilson School, which it's been on there for probably 70 years. A residential college at Princeton has lost the name of Woodrow Wilson, even though Wilson invented the idea of the four-year residential college. And I just read that a school in Tacoma, Washington, Woodrow Wilson High School, is going to take the name off. It'll cost $500,000 to do that, is to eradicate the name of Woodrow Wilson. And I think one thing that's going on here, it seems to me that Americans, since the end of the Cold War, have been much less interested in foreign affairs. Wilson preeminently was honored for being a great international figure. That's really what he was honored for. And we're not interested in that. There's no one left to uphold him or cheer him in the area of international affairs and by history of the United States. If you look online, a lot of the quotations that are being used now to say, gosh, Wilson was dreadful. And so his view of Reconstruction was very much shaped by his own personal experiences.
This has been absolutely fascinating. Woodrow Wilson, Princeton to the presidency, Professor Maynard, Del Maynard, and thank you so much for your time, and we appreciate it very much. And it's just, such a complex, as you presented, but fascinating historical personality. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Ari. Thank you so much.
Hi, this is A. Scott Berg, author of the audiobook Wilson. I think the biggest misconception about Woodrow Wilson, especially for those who have ever seen a photograph of him, think of him as a very cold, dour Presbyterian minister's son. And he was all of those things, but in fact he was incredibly complicated emotionally. He was a man really full of life, great passion, probably the most passionate president we've ever had. Woodrow Wilson was very hesitant to get us into the First World War because he grew up in the South before the Civil War, and he remembered the Civil War. He saw it, and he saw the devastation that war imposed upon a nation. So he did everything possible, and he did keep us out of the First World War for several years. And then it finally reached a point in which he realized we finally had to join the world and go to war. I think the essence of Woodrow Wilson's legislative philosophy was to cooperate with the other branch. He felt the executive branch and the legislative branches should work together. They should cooperate with the government. And for that reason, he used to come down to the Capitol very often. He's the only president who called repeatedly joint sessions of Congress so he could put his agenda forth and really argue for it. It's rather important to me that Wilson be an audiobook because he grew up in a great oral tradition. He, being the son and grandson and great-grandson of Presbyterian ministers, he grew up listening to sermons, and he spoke in a sermonic style. He was the last president to write all of his own speeches, and there is a cadence to Wilson's speeches. There's a rhythm to them, and it's almost like one wave coming in after another. I'm looking forward to hearing two speeches in particular. The first was his asking Congress to declare war. This was April 2nd, 1917, and it was an extremely eloquent speech. The second is one he gave after the war had been fought and won, and Wilson had been in Paris for months negotiating the peace settlement. And just before returning home with this peace treaty, he went to the American cemetery just outside of Paris on Memorial Day, and he gave a speech to the people who had gathered there, during which he could barely contain his emotion. And it too was one of the most eloquent speeches ever. Everybody who was present and covered that speech said there was just weeping everywhere around him. And so in many ways, I think the listener of this book will get a dimension that the reader won't get.